Okay, today is August 13th, 2015. My name's Susan West. I'm on Hatteras Island talking to Mark Jordana. We're going to talk a little bit about how Mark ended up being a frequent visitor and a part-time resident of Hatteras Island 20 or 30 years ago. Mark, you're from Virginia, right?
My family lives in Virginia now. We actually grew up in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. And that's where we lived when we discovered the Outer Banks.
Do you remember how you discovered it?
Yeah, my dad, who worked for a shipping company, had a client at the Department of Agriculture named Jack Cushing, who had actually grown up in Massachusetts and had spent quite a bit of time in his youth in Cape Cod, and he knew about the Outer Banks just as another kind of remote barrier island setting similar to Cape Cod, and he encouraged all of our families to come down on vacation in as early as 1963 was the first year that we came down.
So wait, you took the ferry across? Or
we rode the ferry across Oregon Inlet the first time we came.
Do you remember that?
Yeah. The only thing I remember about that, because I was 5 years old, was I was sitting in line for the ferry, and of course nobody had air conditioning, and in the car immediately next to me there was a boy about my age, and his father jumped out of the car, ran around, yanked him out of the car immediately next to me, next to the window, held him upside down, and whacked him on his back because he was choking on a piece of candy. And this all happened about 3 feet away from me, and that's the part of the ferry ride I remember. So, pretty traumatic.
Okay.
So, but we, and at that time, of course, there was nothing but, telephone poles and straight road for 30 miles with a, little outpost in Rodanthe to get to Avon. And we actually stayed at the Buxton Motel the first few times we came down.
Okay. Do you know which motel in Buxton?
Bill Dillon's motel.
Okay. Do you remember what that was like?
Well, there was little cabins and, screen porches, and I don't remember much of the inside, but we had come with 3 families, and they had kids all, sort of the same age as me and my sister. My brother wasn't even born yet, my younger brother, so, there was a lot of kids to hang out, and we short walked to the beach, and, of course, those were the motels that were in Buxton just as you came into town, and, it's changed a little bit, but...
Were there restaurants, or did you cook in your cabins? I
think we were cooking in the cabin. I mean, there may have been a few restaurants, but this was kind of a low-budget expedition, right? So we, I bet those cabins were $100 a week, and they were efficiencies and came with kitchens.
So how many years did you do that?
Well, we did that several years in the 60s, and around 1967, my father bought a lot in Hatteras Colony in Avon, and 2 years later we built a cottage out there, and the cottage was built by Dewey Scarborough from Avon.
Was that one of the first cottages out in Hatteras Colony in Avon?
Well, it certainly looks different today, but there was probably a couple dozen cottages built in Hatteras Colony at that time. So we were on Beachcomber, and on the whole Beachcomber loop there was probably 6 cottages total.
Okay. Yeah, there were more than that today. So then you had a place to stay at when you came to Hatteras Island. Did the other families continue to visit?
Yeah, they did. In fact, they also bought lots, and some of them built houses, and this whole contingent of families from the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. would come down here sometimes together and eventually, sort of on their own, and bring other family members and stuff like that. So,
do you have any idea why Hatteras Island was attractive to your parents at that time?
I think it was probably because it was just the remotest, wildest beach that anybody had ever been on, and the lifestyle in Washington D.C. even at that time was probably pretty hectic, not for us kids, but for the adults, and it was a great getaway.
Okay. So, your dad had something to do with the Avon Pier. What happened there?
Well, I mean, I guess that, my dad had befriended Dewey Scarborough through the process of building the house there, and he had mentioned to Dewey that, yeah, I'd love to have a business down here someday. And sometime, I believe in early 1970, we were down here at our cottage, and Dewey came over and said, "Hey Joe, were you really serious about having a business down here?" And my dad, not knowing what he was getting himself into, said, "Yeah, sure, that seems like a great idea." And Dewey said, "Well, the Avon Fishing Pier is for sale." So Dewey introduced my dad to the owner group, and as I recall, and I'm not sure about the exact dates, but I believe the pier was originally built in 1964, so this would have been 6 years later, and I believe that was the original ownership group that was selling it.
Okay. So, sold the pier to your dad. Did he have partners?
Yeah, it turned out that he had most of the gentlemen that had been coming down as a group to go on vacation join in. So it was my father, Joe Jordana, and then Harris Havert, who is David Havert's father, who ended up being a resident of Avon a few years later. Mr. Homero Vega, who was actually a Mexican citizen in the Mexican Navy, worked in the Mexican Embassy in Washington, D.C., but was our neighbor in Washington. And Mr. Vega also had a cottage at the opposite end of Beachcomber, and two of his grandsons now have a surf shop in Avon that they've had for years. There was Jack Cushing, who is the one that originally introduced us down here, and ended up being a longtime resident on the Outer Banks. And then there was a gentleman named Joe Ryan, who had brought his family from the very beginning back in 1963. And I believe Joe bought lots also in Beachcomber, but I don't believe he ever built a house. So those were the five partners, along with Dewey, who put together this prospective ownership group to purchase the pier.
Do you have any idea how much they paid for the pier?
I don't know the exact numbers, but I always recall hearing that they bought the pier for about $100,000 in 1970.
Okay, so now your dad and his partners own a pier. Who ran the pier?
Well, Jack Cushing still worked for the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. He actually had a pretty good federal job. He was a relatively young man, probably less than 40 years old, and had probably a very bright future with the federal government. And he somehow convinced his wife, Ellie, and quit the whole thing and volunteered to come down and live on the island and be the manager of the pier. So Jack came down and ended up, buying a house in Buxton and working on the pier in those early years.
Okay. Did your family spend a lot of time on the pier?
We did. We had the cottage there in Avon, and we would come usually at Easter time, and the cottage was winterized for the winter, so we'd get the pump primed and the water running, and we'd stay for the week around Easter, and then we would come in the summer for a couple of weeks, and then we would usually come around Thanksgiving and spend a week, and then my dad would winterize the cottage so it was all set for the winter. So we probably spent 4 weeks out of the year down here during those early years in the 70s. And
was your dad active in the management of the pier?
Well, of that group, my dad was the president. They put together a corporation or a LLC, and my father was the president of that group. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day management activities, but he did sort of function in the role of president of the whole corporation.
And when this was transpiring, putting together the group to buy the pier, do you remember your dad one night at the dinner table saying, "Hey kids, we're going to buy a pier"?
I don't remember the specific evening when it came up, but you know, it was talk, and then it was a reality. So.
And what did you think about that?
Well, I thought it was great. I mean, obviously, when we came down here on vacation and stayed in the cottage, we would go to the pier, you know, several times and fish, and it was always, you know, sort of fun and, you know, obviously very, very different than, you know, our day-to-day routine back in the city. So, you know, we thought it was a great idea.
And at the time when your family bought the pier, you were still living in Maryland?
We were, and we lived in Maryland, and I distinctly remember when we came down, the entire ramp was covered with sand that had blown or washed there during the preceding winter. And so David Havert and his younger brother Donald and I were given the task of trying to shovel a pathway up the ramp that, you know, people could get there. I mean, it was the sand was at least 3 feet deep across the entire ramp. So we, you know, carved a trail that was about, you know, 3 feet wide, and it kind of made a big S-turn down the ramp. And I distinctly remember that when we were done, that the pier had shopping carts for the patrons to get their fishing gear up. And we all had paper routes up in Washington where we used shopping carts to get our papers delivered. And we knew how to ride shopping carts, so we would just take turns riding the shopping carts down this little pathway through the sand on the ramp that we had made. And of course, you'd get to the bottom and there was still a big pile of sand, and you'd slam into it and tumble over and go face first and laugh and run up the hill and do it again.
So how long did your dad and the other partners own the pier?
Well, they bought it in 1970, and they owned it for the entire decade. I think that they finally sold the pier in the early 80s, and what triggered that, I don't think any of them specifically wanted out of the business, but there was a significant storm that washed away probably 260 feet off the end of the pier in March 1980, and shortly thereafter there was another storm that took 90 more feet. And once they started getting estimates for what it was going to cost to repair it, I think they realized they had no choice but to try to find a buyer group that was better financed that could repair the pier.
Did you ever work on the pier?
Oh yeah, I worked on the pier. I graduated high school in 1975 and came down and worked on the pier that fall, 1975, and then off and on for the better part of the rest of the 70s. There was the original owners had put a little room on the pier house for the pier operator to live in. It was 12 feet by 12 feet, and it had a sink, and that was it. And that was my home for, you know, probably 1,000 days in the late 70s. And I would, you know, we built a campground out in the parking lot, and there was a campground house that had showers, so I could go down there and shower. And I ate an awful lot of the Stewart sandwiches that they made in the very, very early microwaves. I'm not sure those things were particularly healthy, but I ate an awful lot of them. And I lived there on the pier, and I worked there, and I learned to surf and surfed right out there in Avon.
So you basically learned to surf in Avon?
Well, I learned to surf in Virginia Beach. We lived in Maryland at the time we bought it, but we moved to Virginia Beach in 1973, and I finished high school there and initially surfed in Virginia Beach. But as soon as I graduated high school, I moved to Hatteras and really got much more skilled as a surfer once I moved to the Outer Banks.
And did you surf right there in Avon at the pier?
Yeah, actually at that time in the late 70s, one of the best breaks on the island was the south side of the pier, and the pier house where I lived was in the southwest corner of the pier house. and I had to move my head about 6 inches in the morning to check the waves. I used to joke that I was the only person on the island that lived east of the dune line. Now that there's been erosion and people have built cottages that are sitting out on the beach with no dunes, then that's not true anymore. But at the time, in the late 70s, I was probably the only person living east of the dune line.
And what was there out there on the beach, like south of the pier at that time?
Well, there was nothing. I could look from the pier, and on a clear day, I could see the lighthouse, and there was absolutely no structures south of the pier until the motels at the very entrance to Buxton. There was nothing in Kinnickinnic Shores. That was all just open dunes. There was, like, in fact, during the late 70s, the first cottage was built out there, because I remember that the guys that built that house had come down from New York, and they would come up on the pier and get food and cokes and stuff because they were building the house themselves. And that was the original structure being built in that whole stretch.
When you were living and working on the pier, do you remember any spectacular runs of fish or big fish that were caught? Or what was the clientele on the pier like in those days? Do you know where they came from? Would the locals use it?
I don't recall that there was a significant amount of local population coming out there fishing. I think that may be because most of them had some link to commercial fishing on the backside of the island and stuff like that. There was quite a few fishermen that came from eastern North Carolina that would come out there and fish for, you know, the smaller fish that ran, you know, the flounder and the spot and the croaker and that sort of fishing. But in the fall, there was a significant run on redfish, and it frankly was the best place in the world to catch large red drum. And that was because before the end of the pier got washed away, you could stand on the end and cast and reach the sandbar that the redfish swam down. And during the time that I worked there, there was typically on the order of 200 redfish that weighed in excess of 40 pounds caught from the pier during the month of November. And the fishermen at that time included quite a few actual professional fishermen. The guides from the Keys would come up. A lot of fishermen from New Jersey that caught striped bass would come down. So there was actually a fair amount of competition out there on the end of the pier. And there would be times when there would probably be 50 lines in the water off the end of the pier, red fishing, and when the schools swam by, it wouldn't be one fish. There could easily be a half dozen redfish that would all get hooked up within 60 seconds of each other. And of course, the guys that had fish on wanted everybody else to get clear, and the people that didn't have fish on weren't about to pull their bait in because they knew the school was swimming by. So it could be pretty chaotic, but you know, typically when I was working, they would bring the fish in wheelbarrows, and we would weigh them, and we would put a sheet of paper up on the garage door with the name and the date, the name of the fisherman, and the weight of the fish. And we would, by the end of the season, at the end of November, the entire garage door, both on the east and west side, would be covered with these written, you know, documentation of the redfish caught that November.
So, after your dad and his partners sold the pier, do you know if Jack stayed on the island after that, or did he leave?
As far as I know, I mean, Jack was a family friend, and I believe he stayed here for years. And of course, I went off to school and went my own way, so I don't know exactly how long he stayed on the island. He raised his children here. Robbie and Valerie were both, you know, raised for the better part of their childhood on the island. And I suspect that he worked here and there, and eventually, I know that they did sell their home in Buxton and leave the island. You know, but the whole, you know, once the end of the pier washed away, then when it got rebuilt by the next ownership group, instead of building it back out to its original length, what they did was they built a wider tee at the end so more people could fish from the end. But of course, they didn't build it as long as it was, and no one could get their bait on that sandbar anymore. And it was no longer a renowned redfish location. My guess is the fish still swim by on the sandbar, but nobody could get their bait out there. So the fish are there, but no one can catch them. So.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time this evening. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, it was a good time, back in that era. So.
Well, yeah, not too many people have lived on a fishing pier.
No, I like to think that. So.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, thank you.
I drank beer on a fishing pier.